Hello, Gene Schwimmer here. Welcome to today's vlog. Today's vlog might be a little bit less organized than they usually are, because not that they're all that organized sometimes anyways, but I do have an appointment to get to. But I got a couple of comments that I want to reply to, and one of them is going to take a while. As I've said in the past, I'm a real estate broker by trade. I do have a day job, so I got to try to get this all in because I want to do it today while the iron is hot. You know, strike when the iron is hot, and I just got these comments this morning. So here we go. The first one is from Turbo Jones. Turbo Jones is making a request. Teach us about NGOs. Are they connected to the CIA or the State Department? Rudy Giuliani is furious with the State Department in Ukraine because he's convinced our aid is being funneled to specific NGOs. That's non-governmental organization, by the way. That's what the NGO stands for. Affiliated with George Soros. William Barr just called Soros out publicly for working against law enforcement. So NGOs, I would love to honor the request if Turbo Jones wants to be a little more specific about which NGOs Turbo Jones means, because, well, yeah, there are NGOs that are financed, sponsored by George Soros, and you also have organizations such as the Students for Justice in Palestine, who are affiliated with a Muslim Brotherhood. They get funding from them. But frankly, I am not aware of any NGOs that are even being accused of being funded by governments, at least anti-American NGOs. I'm not really aware of even the accusation, whether it has any basis in fact. So I need more information about the specific organizations, and then I can do some research on those organizations and see what I can find. And if I find something, I'll report it. Well, let me make a little addendum to that, because that will take us into today's subject, the main thing I want to talk about. The European Union funds NGOs, but to my knowledge, they just fund anti-Israel NGOs, and these are Israeli NGOs in Israel. There was a big controversy sometime back in Israel, whether, just as we require foreign agents to register in the United States, they wanted to have these Israeli organizations that are being funded by the European Union to identify themselves, to publish the fact that they are not supported by Israeli citizens, they are supported by other countries. And this takes us into Israel, because I want to address this other comment. This is going to take, I think, a while. I will cover everything as much as I can, but I put links in the description below the video so you can do more research, because there really is a lot of literature on this. But I'll try to sum up as best I can. So this comment is to the video that I just did. This is the one I did about the Democratic debate, where we had several Democratic candidates talking about the issue between, or the conflict between, Israel and the Palestinians, that these candidates are calling for pressure on Israel, even though Israel has repeatedly said that they would talk anytime, anywhere, without conditions. The Palestinians are the ones who refuse to talk anywhere, anytime, and they want preconditions. So my point was, why is the pressure on Israel? They've already agreed to talk. All the pressure should be on the Palestinians, if there's going to be any pressure. Personally, I don't think you need any pressure, direct pressure, except, as I said, for the Israelis to build as many settlements as they want, wherever they want to build them, as long as the Palestinians are refusing to talk. And also, we want a non-racist state, just like Israel, despite the accusations, is a non-racist state. I'll discuss this in more detail probably in some later vlog. But the Palestinians want a state in which not one Jew lives. such as in Gaza. They talk about an occupation in Gaza. I'm going to get into occupation, but in Gaza there are no Jews at all. So they are not occupied by any definition, even the erroneous definition that I'm going to discuss today. But getting back to the main point, if we're not going to have a racist state, that means Jews will be allowed to live in a Palestinian state if there ever is one. So the settlements should not be a problem because Jews are going to be allowed to live there anyhow if they're talking about, and that is what is incumbent on the Palestinians, by the way, to make the Jews who are there now feel that they would be safe in a Palestinian state because they should be welcome to stay there, unless we're talking about a racist state. And then if these Palestinians and their supporters are talking about a racist state, then they should stop accusing Israel of being racist. When you have over a million, I think is 1,200,000, 20% of the Israeli population is Arab. Palestinians want a binational state because they won't recognize a Jewish state next to an Arab-only state. To me, that should not be acceptable. So now let me read the comment, and I will give you my comments. Because, well, I should also mention, I usually don't reply to comments, and I have a policy of deleting, or I had, as I'm going to explain in a second, a policy of deleting anti-Semitic comments. On that latter point, I decided that is not the way to go. I should let the world see these comments and I should reply to them. That is the right way. So unless something is really over the line, then I'm going to just let the comments stay there, let them speak for themselves, and probably or possibly not even reply to them. I'm replying to this comment specifically because, as I've said in the past, I leave the comment section for all of you because I have this whole vlog to give you my point of view. I only jump in when I see factual errors, or in this case, completely false narrative, and especially when it's an anti-Semitic narrative, as I'm going to explain as we go along. So you'll have to bear with me. This is going to be perhaps a long vlog, so if you don't have a lot of time, I'm letting you know in advance because, again, there's a lot to cover here. Now, I just said the comment is anti-Semitic. That is not the same as saying that the commenter, David Adams, is anti-Semitic. There is an alternate explanation, which is that David Adams is just simply ignorant, that he just reads this stuff from, I don't know, Students for Justice in Palestine, or just any left-wing website. He just reads this stuff and he repeats it. So I don't know if he's writing what he wrote out of ignorance or anti-Semitism. I'll just leave that up to everybody else to decide. I don't know David Adams. I've not heard anything that he has said in other places at other times. So it would be wrong to make an accusation, which is a very strong accusation. He may just be ignorant. But those are the only two explanations, as you'll see as I now address all the points in the comment. So, well, let me just read the comment. The Palestinians have the right under international law to resist occupation, ethnic cleansing, annexation, aggression, and colonization. And Israel, as an occupying power, cannot justify military force as self-defense in territory for which it is responsible as the occupant. I think you mean occupier, not occupant. By definition, an aggressor cannot act in defense. Israel is asserting rights that may be consistent with colonial domination, but simply do not exist under international law. Now, I'm going to address, there are several points here But first, I just mentioned anti-Semitism, so I want to give the internationally recognized by the United States and 30 other countries now. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. They promulgated a working definition of anti-Semitism. There are several points in that definition. I'm just going to read a couple of them here that you can keep in mind as we go along. So here are the 2 points. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g., that means, for example, if you don't know, e.g., by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Number 2, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. That second point is the one that I want to focus on the most. The first one, well, I don't know if David Adams, there are people who like to claim that Jews are white colonialists who have just decided to live in Palestine, even though there was never a country called Palestine, which I'll get to in a minute, that they are white colonialists and they are just invading another country and taking it over, like the English and the French going into Africa. That is factually false, as we'll find out. But to be fair to David Adams, he may only be talking about the part where the Palestinians live. He may, as Sanders said at the debate, believe that Israel does have a right to exist with certain borders, but we don't know what those borders are because they have never been settled. This 1967 borders, they talk about the 67 borders, that is really just the 1949 armistice line where the 2 sides were, the Jordanians and the Israelis were when the fighting stopped. And I emphasize Israelis and Jordanians. There were no Palestinians. There was no concept of a Palestinian people. That came in the 70s. It was to, well, I'm old enough to remember the 67 war, the news and the statements that were made by President Nasser of Egypt in the run-up to the war. And it was all about throwing the Jews into the sea. There was nothing about establishing a Palestinian state. And you have to remember that from 1967, when Israel conquered the area, in a war of self-defense, by the way, we'll get to that also, that area between there and the Jordan River, that was occupied by Jordan, an occupation that the international community, except for I believe 1 country, refused to recognize. So it wasn't a country, it was occupied by Jordan. But the point I want to make is you have this 20-year period from 1967 to about 1988 when you had the Oslo Accords, that it was occupied by Jordan. There was no call from the people living there for a Palestinian state, even though that area was in Arab hands for 20 years. And in fact, the Palestinians, the so-called Palestinians, they were, well, I'm not going to use so-called. I mean, if they want to call themselves Palestinians, we can call them Palestinians. That's perfectly fine. But they had Jordanian citizenship. And actually, I'm going to do a future vlog with a Saudi writer just stating the simple fact that Jordan is overwhelmingly Palestinian. It's basically a Palestinian state ruled by a Hashemite minority. King Abdullah, he's a Hashemite. So as this writer is going to, well, I won't go into that now. I'll make that in a future vlog. The point is that these Arabs living between the Jordan and the armistice line of 1949, they were Jordanian citizens until Abdullah's father, King Hussein, revoked their citizenship and relinquished his claim to the land between the Jordan and the 49 armistice line. And that's one of the sources of this problem. If King Hussein had not done that, then it would have been a negotiation between Israel and Jordan. A border hopefully would have been drawn somewhere, and there would be no Palestinian state. Add another fact, that the Palestine Liberation Organization, Arafat's organization, and by the way, Arafat was an Egyptian. He wasn't a Palestinian, he was an Egyptian, born in Cairo. But what's important about the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is that it was formed in 1964, 3 years before the 67 war, when the land that the Palestinians today are saying that they want for a state was in Arab hands. So when you have an organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization, what are they talking about? They were not, I assure you, talking about liberating that land from Jordan. They were talking about destroying Israel. And if you look today, this very day, the government maps in the Palestinian Authority, and in the school books too, they don't show Israel at all. They call it Palestine. Now, I want to focus on this second point here. Applying double standards by requiring of it, that's Israel, a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Because that's what we're really talking about at the end of the day. A double standard. One standard for Israel and another standard for every other country, including France and England and, well, us too, the United States of America. So we'll start here with the first part of the quote. The Palestinians have the right under international law to resist occupation, ethnic cleansing, annexation, aggression, and colonization. Well, so does Israel. No, Israel was occupied by the Romans. It's a little bit of ancient history here. Was occupied by the Romans in 63 BC. They were exiled, not all of them, 80% were exiled in 70 AD, and the Second Temple was destroyed at that time too. I'm putting up a photo of the Arch of Titus. That is a triumphal arch near the Colosseum in Italy, depicting the exile of the Jews. It was Titus who destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews, 80% of the Jews. 20% of the Jews stayed behind. Jews have lived in that area continuously for 3,000 years. I'm also linking to several images from the Israeli Antiquities Authority, but let me just talk by way of illustration about one of these artifacts that was recently discovered. Put the headline up. Rare ancient seal of Jewish king's officer discovered in City of David in Jerusalem. The Israel Antiquities Authority and Tel Aviv University discovered a 2,600-year-old ancient bulla seal impression bearing the inscription, quote, belonging to Nathan Melech, but it would be Natan Melech, servant of the king, unquote, in the city of David, just outside the old city of Jerusalem, according to an announcement on Sunday. Quote, although it is not possible to determine with complete certainty that the Natan Melech who is mentioned in the Bible was in fact the owner of the stamp, it is impossible to ignore some of the details that link them together, unquote. Dr. Anat Mendel Gaberovich of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Center for the Study of Ancient Jerusalem, who deciphered the seal, said in a statement. Natan Melech is named as an officer in the court of King Josiah in Kings 2, chapter 23, verse 11. You can take that for what it's worth, whether you think that's the right Natan Melech or not. My point is that, as I said, I'm linking to images of several artifacts, but there are any number of artifacts. This one is 2,600 years old. That inscription is ancient Hebrew. There's no doubt of a Jewish presence going back several thousand years, well, at least 2,600 years by this. But if there are Arab and other critics / haters of Israel who want to cling to this contention that Arabs are the indigenous population of the area, that they were there before the Jews? Well, there's a very simple way to prove it. All you need is a shovel. Grab a shovel, dig anywhere in Israel. I just showed you an artifact that is 2,600 years old with ancient Hebrew on it, proof of a Jewish presence 2,600 years ago. Just dig and find an older artifact. Find an Arab artifact that is older than 2,600 years. One of the reasons it takes longer to build a structure in Israel or a parking lot or anything is because as soon as you start digging, you come across these ancient Jewish artifacts, and they have to, under Israeli law, stop and call in the archaeologists to examine the area, and very often they close off the area so that they can excavate the site for artifacts. Now we have the Arabs in the Palestinian Authority. They are free to grab a shovel and just dig and find an older artifact. You have the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock right there on the Temple Mount. You can dig beneath that and look for artifacts that are older than 2,600 years. If you can't find it, then you just have to admit that Jews are the indigenous population of that area. Arabs came to the area in the Arab conquest of 638. The Palestinians are descendants of those people. Arabs are not native to that area. Jews are the indigenous people of that area. So they are not occupiers. There is no, if we're talking about international law, there is no statute of limitations on if you are exiled from your country or if somebody occupies your country from when you can get your country back. Now, when we talk about double standards, think of France being occupied by Germany. Nobody disputed France's right to get its land back from Germany. Poland was occupied. Poland got not just its land or her land back, but part of Germany is now part of Poland, because when you launch an aggressive war, you lose land. That is permitted under international law. But of all the false and anti-Semitic or ignorant, take your pick, narratives about Israel, the one that bothers me the most, the one that I think is the most damaging and pervasive, is this switching of roles, of turning Israel, the country that was attacked 3 times, 1948, 1967, 1973, into the aggressor and making the Arabs the victims, switching their places. And why? Just because the Israelis, the Jews, had the audacity to win. If they had lost and they had been killed, thrown into the sea, as was the goal in 1967 at least, you would have the so-called international community clucking their tongues, shaking their heads, saying, oh, what a pity, how bad. But the Israelis won, and they won in a week, at least in 1967. And that's when the whole narrative changed. Before it was, we're going to throw the Jews into the sea. I remember that very well, because I was alive at the time, following the news. But right after that, it switched to the Arabs suddenly became freedom fighters, and the Jews became evil white colonialists, even though, if you want to know why Israel has such an effective secret service, the Mossad, is because Israelis and Arabs are physically indistinguishable, a lot of them. You have Ethiopian Jews who they're black, they're Africans. Jews are a multiracial people. They don't all look like me. They don't want to accept that. They want to claim that they're white colonialists. And we have to remember how the European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews who came back to join the Mizrahi Jews, who are the ones who stayed there, the Oriental Jews who were there the entire time, that, well, there was no Israel, there was no army. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. They could not come back without the consent of the Ottoman Empire, of the Turks, and they had that consent. Not only that, they were welcomed because the area was barren. The Arabs weren't doing anything with it. They said, well, these Jews seem to have this crazy love of this desert area. Let them come back if they want to. And they did come back, and they did not conquer the land. They had no army. They bought it. They bought it, and now the Arabs, I guess it's seller's remorse. They're sorry that they sold it, but that land was sold. They bought it, and it was the worst land. It was swamp and desert, for which they paid exorbitant prices, but they irrigated the land, and they drained the swamps, and they turned it into what Israel is today. And by 1845, this would be decades before the Zionist movement, which started in 1899, the turn of the 20th century, and 100 years before the 48 war. Jews were already, they had been kept out forcibly on pain of death, had been kept out of Jerusalem for centuries, but by 1845 they were the majority again. They were the majority of the population in Jerusalem. Little historical fact there for you, for those who might be interested. But the point is that they were invited back by the Turks. They did not just come in and conquer the area. That's number one. Number two, the Jews and the Arabs got along very well. They fought together actually against the Turks to liberate the area from the Turks. The problem started when the Arabs said, help us liberate the area from the Turks and we will treat you very well. And the Jews said, well, thank you very much, but we intend to have our own state. We intend to govern ourselves, not to be governed by Arabs. That's where the division really started, right at that point. But we also have to go to, now I'm getting into modern times, I want to talk about international law now, because there's this big point about that the Israelis are violating international law somehow by being in that area between the 1949, or just being in that area at all between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, but specifically between the 49 armistice line and the Jordan River. So let's look at the legal documents here. Now, there is only one legal, well, we have to have a little history. World War I, the Ottoman Empire sided with the Germans. The Germans lost. The French and the English conquered the area, and that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. So you had this big area that no longer had a sovereign. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. The French and the English, basically they got together, and as the conquerors, they divided the land up between them, and they created several countries. They created Syria and Lebanon and 3 or 4 other countries that later combined with Syria to make a bigger Syria. And if you want to know why in the past there were these few decades that Syria had soldiers in Lebanon, Syria was occupying Lebanon because the Syrians had intended for Lebanon to be absorbed into Syria with these other countries, and the Lebanese did not want to go along with it. Little historical note there for you. There are only 2 pre-existing countries in that area that the English and the French conquered. Egypt, obviously, is thousands of years old. And, well, it's Iran now, but Persia, obviously, is an ancient civilization. But the rest was just part of the Ottoman Empire, and it had been for a millennium. What the French and the British did, they divided the area between themselves, and then the French, in their part, the northern part, they created several countries. And it's interesting to know, people who oppose the creation of Israel, Saudi Arabia was created in 1943, only 5 years before Israel declared independence. I should say reestablished, not created. Because Israel dated back thousands of years, but it had been occupied by various powers for 2,000 years. And the last occupying power at that time was the British. The British, that was the British mandate. They specifically promised to create a Jewish homeland there. Now, the agreement that divided the area between the British and the French, that was the Sykes-Picot Agreement of, I think, 1920. That was followed by the League of Nations mandate of 1922. And what is important to note is that the League of Nations resolutions remained binding on its successor, the United Nations. So the only legal agreement that talks about that area that is enforceable, that is international law, is the 1922 British mandate. So let me read you something, and I link to it so you can read the whole thing, but I'll just read you a couple excerpts here. This is from the introduction, from where you have all the whereases. So let me just read them to you. Whereas the principal Allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory, that would be Britain, should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917. This is the Balfour Declaration that this mandate is referring to. The Balfour Declaration that said that His Majesty's government would view favorably the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So continuing now with a quote, November 2nd, 1917, by the government of His Britannic Majesty and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. In other words, like Israel today. Going on, second quote here, whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. And then it goes on, there are some more whereases. But that is important, that second one, because this is another obstacle to peace, which is the Arabs' refusal, or at least the ones in the Palestinian Authority. Other Arabs have changed, as I'm going to illustrate when I get to the end of this, what's turning out to be a long talk. But on that second point, whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine, the Arabs in the Palestinian Authority and in Gaza, and frankly the United Nations too, they passed a resolution that shamefully the Obama administration abstained from, calling the eastern part of Jerusalem occupied territory, even though Jews are the indigenous population of Jerusalem. And they just write them completely out of the history. That is a problem, the refusal to recognize that. But also, note this phrase here, grounds for reconstituting their national home, not creating a national home, reconstituting a national home. In other words, recognizing the historical connection of the Jewish people with that land and recognizing that there was a kingdom of Israel that existed thousands of years earlier and for thousands of years until the Romans conquered it in 63. Well, there was also a 50-year interregnum when the Babylonians conquered it and the Jews were exiled, or most of them were exiled for about 50 years, and then Cyrus the Great, Persian, by the way, the forerunners of the Iranians, allowed them to return. But the big occupation was by the Romans, began in 63 BC, and then the Romans became the Byzantines with the rise of Christianity, and then the Arabs conquered it, and then the Turks conquered it. It was fought over for millennia, literally for millennia. But Jews are the original population. They are the indigenous people of that area. And this is where we get to that definition of anti-Semitism, of treating Israel different from other countries. Because nobody denied the French to get France back from Germany. Nobody denied China the right to get China back from Japan. And if you are from Spain, any Spanish people watching this, you should be aware that these same people who are claiming that Palestine, quote unquote Palestine, is theirs, they believe that part of Spain is still there because Spain was occupied. Well, that's another example. Spain was occupied by the Moors, by Muslims, from 711 until 1492. Nobody questions Spain's right to take that land back as they did in 1492. But you have, or you had, he's dead now, thank God, but Osama bin Laden, he was claiming the right to take back Andalusia. That's what the Moors, the Arabs, called the part of Spain that they occupied from 711 until 1492. But nobody questions, well, no one calls it an occupation. No one calls it the Spanish occupation. But Israel, again, is being treated different. But getting back, as I said, I'm trying to get all this in because I have to rush off to an appointment, and just bear with me. But getting back to international law, that 1922 League of Nations mandate is the only legal document governing the disposition of that area. Now, I'm going to show you something else here. I'm going to show you, and because this gets to another point, that there seems to be this belief among a lot of our friends overseas that agreements made with Jews or the Jewish state can be just discarded at any time. And this is a good example right here. I'm going to show you two maps. This is the original mandate map. This was the area that was intended to be a Jewish homeland. And if you look at that map, you can see, well, you can see the Red Sea, you can see the Jordan River going north from the Dead Sea. You can see that's a much bigger area than what Israel is today. But then you look at this second map. This is the final map. And as you can see, the British gave the biggest half of it, the eastern half, to create Transjordan, which is now today Jordan. So already that was an agreement that was broken. But you can see the Jewish Palestine there. That was still intended to be a Jewish state, and that is a legally binding document. It is the only legally binding document. Now, since we're talking about international law, I want to talk about because this is another point that bothers me, not just about this, but people citing international law. They just use the phrase international law without, well, some of them misinterpret, because the international law that we are really talking about is the Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. It's clear to me, well, some people are just misinterpreting parts of it, and I think it's deliberate in some cases, but it's clear to me that some people, I believe this David Adams, I don't think he read it. I don't think he read the Geneva Convention. He just says international law. These people, they just throw out the term international law. So I linked to the Geneva Convention of 1949. That's the operative one. It's in, the other one was, the original one was shortly before, well, it was right after World War I. So 1949, they added some new provisions to take account of events that happened during World War II. I linked to it. You can read the whole thing, but I'm just going to address a couple of points because obviously I'm not going to read the whole, well, the entire thing doesn't apply. But the first thing to understand, it's in the very beginning, is that it's an agreement between what they call high contracting parties. A high contracting party is a sovereign country, a nation. There has never been, well, that's what they're arguing about. The Palestinians are saying that they want a state. That means there is no state. There is no state of Palestine. So the Geneva Convention on that basis alone does not apply to them. But let's just assume that it does. Here is the title. Let me read you the title. Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war of 12 August 1949. That is important, and that is something that I've never heard anybody, any of these critics mention. Relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. So if you say it applies to the Palestinians, then we have a tacit admission that Israel and the Palestinian Authority, or Israel and the Palestinians, that they are at war. They say they want peace, they want a state or whatever. They are technically, according to this, in a state of war. And the rules about occupation apply to countries that are in a state of war. Now, I want to, because this is a narrative that gets misstated all the time. So I do want to, if it's a digression, I want to digress a bit to this. But the settlements, the Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, which is another thing that bothers me. The term West Bank came into use after Jordan conquered it, and the international community, all countries except for, I think, one, refused to recognize the occupation, so they called it the West Bank because they didn't want to call it Jordan. But the proper historical names are Judea and Samaria. It's actually two areas, one north, one south, Judea and Samaria. So the presence of these Jewish settlements that are not really settlements, they're neighborhoods, because the Jews have a right to live there. They are neighborhoods, and they are not occupiers, they are inhabitants. They are residents of neighborhoods and towns. But we hear this over and over again, this criticism that it violates international law, it violates the Geneva Convention that says that an occupying power should not or shall not transfer its citizens or other people into an occupied area. That was introduced after World War II, and it was referring to the forcible transfer by the Germans of Jews into Poland and into concentration camps. That's what it made illegal. Obviously, it didn't apply to Albert Einstein, for instance, fleeing, or anybody else fleeing Germany, voluntarily leaving the country and fleeing to another country. It obviously doesn't apply to that. And in Israel, an example would be, suppose for the sake of argument that the Israeli government decided one day that, well, we don't want any Arabs living in Israel. We don't want any Arabs in the area between the Mediterranean and the 49 armistice line. And then they got a whole bunch of trucks and they seized the Arabs, all the Arabs from the streets, and they forcibly put them onto trucks and forcibly transferred them into Judea and Samaria. That would violate the Geneva Convention. It clearly would. But the voluntary movement of settlers deciding on their own to move into these areas, that does not come under the Geneva Convention. That does not violate the Geneva Convention at all. But getting back to the title of the Geneva Convention, because it is an important point that I have never heard anybody make. As I said, if we are to apply the Geneva Conventions, which Israel is not violating, by the way, but if we are to apply them, then that is a tacit admission by Israel's critics and by the Palestinians that the Palestinians and the Israelis are in a state of war. If they are in a state of war, then the Israelis have a right to occupy that area until the Palestinians surrender. So if they don't want the Israelis there, then they should surrender, which is another point that bothers me, is that as I mentioned in the previous vlog, that so many people want to treat this as some kind of a conflict or a disagreement, and it's not. It's a war. They are at war. The Israelis are winning. I guess I said before they were the victors, but I guess until the Palestinians surrender or admit that they lost in some way, shape, or form, that they are at war. And then Israel has a right to occupy the area. Now, because they are a military occupier, the area is technically under military law. It's not under Israeli civilian law. So if you want the Palestinians, and by the way, they are being governed by the Palestinians. It is the Palestinians putting them in prison. The Israelis just maintain security. It is the Palestinians who are arresting Palestinian journalists and putting them in jail. It is obviously the Palestinians who arrested a Palestinian man who converted to Judaism and put him in jail for converting. So much for religious freedom, that the Palestinians, we should expect them to respect, but obviously they don't. But the good news is, though, that that man was eventually released because of the international pressure. But again, the Israelis were attacked. They did not start any of these wars. They were attacked. And they have a right to occupy the area. But if the military occupation is a problem, then let the Israelis put that area under civilian law, put it under Israeli law so that they can have access to the courts. Well, they do have access to the Israeli courts. As a matter of fact, there were a group of Palestinians who were suing in an Israeli court about being tortured, not by the Israelis, but by the Palestinians. They were arrested, put in prison by the Palestinians, and they were tortured. But obviously, they're not going to get justice in a Palestinian court. They're suing in an Israeli court. So, as far as the right under international law to resist occupation, well, if we're talking about the Geneva Conventions, then they are occupied, and they are the attackers. The people they attacked who won, they have a right to occupy them. Or you can say that it's not an application of the Geneva Convention, in which case stop talking about the Geneva Convention. But in that case, then the Israelis are not occupiers. They are the indigenous population. So one way or the other, they have a right to be there. But the Palestinians, of course, they have a right to be there too. They are not responsible for what their ancestors did. They have a humanitarian right to be there. This is the problem, though, that the Palestinians are claiming that they have a historical right. They don't. They have a humanitarian right because it would be inhumane to just throw them out. And in fact, not only do the Israelis not evict them, they give them jobs. They provide jobs and investment unless the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement pressures an Israeli company to move out, as they did with SodaStream. They were employing a lot of Arabs in the area. They had to move out of their area, and they lost these jobs that pay 3 to 5 times as much as they would earn in a Palestinian job, if they can find a job at all, because there's such high unemployment. But I'm digressing again. Let me just, I know this is getting long. I'll try to wind up with this, is that even though the Israelis have a right to be there, they have said they will negotiate anytime, anywhere, without preconditions, and give up a lot of the land. They're not going to give up half of Jerusalem. They can wait forever for that, the Palestinians. That is not going to happen. And they are not going to give up, because they'd be fools, they're not going to give up land that has strategic military values, such as the Jordan Valley, but they are willing to sit down, and that's just my guess. I mean, maybe they will, because they're willing to sit down without preconditions. It depends what guarantees of security they would get in return. But I want to wind up here on a positive note, because people who believe what David Adams believes, people who obviously hate Israel, as Bob Dylan said, the times they are a-changin'. I'm going to do a vlog on this. It's probably going to be a whole new series of occasional vlogs of the rapprochement that is occurring between Israel and the Arab countries. And by the way, talking about the Arab countries, a little secret for you. I have a very good friend who's an Arab, and I, through him, meet a lot of other Arabs. These Palestinians that you care so much about, I just thought you might want to know. It's a pretty open secret. They hate the Palestinians. They absolutely cannot stand them. I could go into that detail sometime later. I don't know if I will, but Arabs have told me this. These are direct quotes. Well, I won't give you the direct quote. It's pretty rough. But they don't like the Palestinians either, and they hate having to give lip service to this and this notion of the Palestinians. You have the Saudis especially saying that they've pretty much fed up with the Palestinians, because they won't admit that they lost and sit down and talk with the Israelis. So I want to I'm going to do a couple little things here to end this up, showing how the relations are warming between Israel and these Arab countries. They are not going to wait for the Palestinians anymore. They understand the benefits of friendly relations with Israel. In fact, they have friendly relations now. They are helping each other behind the scenes, under the table. But I first want to show you an illustration here. You all know the saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Here is a picture that shows you graphically the difference between the Palestinians and the Israelis. As I said, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Certainly this one is. But I also want to talk now, to end up, I want to talk about the music. That music that you heard under the picture, you may already be familiar with it, but if you're not, that's the Israeli national anthem. But it's not just any Israeli national anthem. This one was played in a very particular place, and this gets to what I was just saying about rapprochement and warming relations between Israel and the surrounding Arab states. That music comes from, and I'm going to play a little video in a second, a Twitter video I think it is, that was played in Bahrain. There was a judo competition in Bahrain, and Israelis were invited to participate. As it turned out, the Israeli won. He won first prize. As they do in the Olympics, they had first, second, and third place winners. They stood on a little podium with their national flags behind them, and their national anthem was played. So this was in Bahrain. The Israeli won. The Jewish Israeli won. You will now see in the video, I'm going to play the whole video. You're going to see the Israeli being awarded the prize with his national flag, the Israeli flag behind him, and the Israeli national anthem playing in Bahrain, an Arab country.
חבר'ה, דגל ישראל, על אדמת אבו דאבי. איזה אלוף. כולם פחדו לי שיעלמו.
Congratulations, go well done. And now for the national anthem of Israel.
חבר'ה,
That is what is happening. So all you Israel haters out there, hate as much as you want, but the train has left the station. You're going to be left behind. Peace is growing between Israel and the Arab states and the Palestinians. You're going to find yourselves all alone holding a bag of, well, I won't say what's in the bag, but, well, camel dung, maybe. But that's what's going to happen because the rest of Arabia, they're tired of waiting for you. They are making friends with Israel. So thumbs up if you like this video. Share it with anybody you think would like the video too. Got any comments? You can put them in the comment section below the video. Suggestions for future topics or questions you'd like me to answer, that can go there too. Finally, subscribe. Well, not I always do that. Semi-finally, almost finally. Subscribe. I love getting new subscribers. And now, really finally, come back and see me again. I look forward to seeing all of you again. And until I do see all of you again, bye.